twisted to such a degree that the full effect of the strangeness of language, of some other language underneath, can be felt. Severo Sardui's language continually displays its French inflections, to the extent that Sardui's language becomes more and more its own code, and within its own code, it talks about its own sense of imperfect closure. A number of years ago, Emil Rodriguez Monegal and Leila Perrone Moises embarked on a project that uncovered how the grammar sources of the great Lautréamont were Spanish in origin. That Spanish was infiltrated within the tissue of the discourse in itself. Monegal and Perrone were not seeking to account for Lautréamont's strangeness. They were not trying to explain it, but rather wanted to show the way in which some mixture of the Spanish, crept in within the nexus of the very strange French that Lautréamont used, and how that was a creative endeavor in the sense that it allowed for the sense of flexibility with language that Lautréamont's grammar absorbed. It was a structuralist enterprise, Monegal and Perrone's, insofar as it was based on the skeleton of language as it moved. If we are to understand the imprint of the bilingual universe in which Latin American literature has always existed, and talk about the fact that in Latin America the monolingual universe is not the norm, it is not a bad thing to reference the case of this Uruguayan poet whose Spanish grammar changed French language forever. There are three projects that are interesting in this regard. The texts where the difference in language, or even the absence of a main language, is an important one. In the first example, Vicente Huidobro, what is important is the question of the subject's relationship to language. In the second example, it is the Portuñol of Nestor Perlonger, where the question of gender and genre comes into play in the notion of a devenir. The third project is the direct intervention of Brazilian poet Wilson Bueno and his stellar poem, Mar Paraguayo, which I will speak about at the end. For a long poem that deals with fragmentation, loss, dispersion, falling, agony, and language, one has to go to Altazor. Vicente Huidobro, the Chilean mastermind, started writing the poem in 1919 and completed it and published it in Spain in 1931, after he failed to become a French poet. Altazor began by lamenting the loss of a sort of serenity, of primordial unity, and it ended with the fall and the possible redemption of language. The text seemed to collapse poet and language, as the poet falls on air and apparently blends into language. This is the canonical reading. There are linguistic fireworks and dazzling deconstructions and reconstructions and language games. As an avant-garde text, it may seem to us now as excessive. There are hundreds of lines that play with the word windmill, and the invented language at the end seemed to have been written in a transcendent code. As a structure, Altazor was like a machine that needed always more oil, a tower that's always about to collapse, not because of some Babelian punishment, but because of its very overblown excess. Huidobro had lived that glorious adventure that we now call the avant-garde, from Cubism to Dada and Surrealism, and he had to include it all. So that the text became a show and tell that was also a compendium, a travelogue, to all the historical avant-gardes, sampled like a playlist on an iPod. Huidobro actually had to show that he knew all the available techniques. And structured as a series of 7 cantos that obviously manifested a problem of continuity. For cantos 4, 5, 6, and 7 really seem to have no connection to the preface and the first 3 cantos. What had happened in the text? This is the question that many critics asked themselves over and over again. One presumably had to read the thing from 1 to 7, like one used to read a novel before Cortázar's hopscotch, from beginning to end. But Huidobro put the event or the disaster within the poem, and we readers never quite realized it. Huidobro just cut the strings of the parachute and left you hanging there. And I quote, "Después del corazón comiendo rosas y de las noches del rubí perfecto, el nuevo atleta salta sobre la pista mágica, jugando con magnéticas palabras, caldeadas como la tierra cuando va a salir un volcán, lanzando sortilegios de sus frases pájaro." Altazor is one of the most insufferable, interesting, fascinating, challenging poems in Latin American literature. It shows the texture of the way in which it was assembled, for the assembly in itself allows you to see the structure within the text. As a mechanism, it points to the constructedness of all works of art. Huidobro will change syllables from word to word. Sal rosa rosalía, sal rosa al día, salía al rol rosasario. And critics have tended to see this as Huidobro's attempt to endow language with a sense of creative praxis that the word of gods are said to possess. But I think Altazor is also a grand poem that constantly shows us the fact that it was conceived in a different language, that the construction in itself entailed a process of selection, where the language could never quite be Spanish, and it could never quite be French, but rather some kind of in-between space. Hence, Huidobro's opening of the poem in order to reveal its construction, and at the same time, in order to show how the text was made. In the historic time and place in which it was conceived, Huidobro's indeterminacy about language did not sit well with the universe in which Europe and Latin America were antithetical entities, understood as a metropolitan culture vis-a-vis the country of origin, or a country of origin. Migration in this context was all about ensuring the permanence of the wall that separated Latin America from Europe, or even Spain from France. This is why there can be no border consciousness for Huidobro, for the validation of language entailed irremediably the fact that the poet had to disappear, had to sacrifice himself within it. In other words, the opposition in the poem says that validating the language entails the disappearance of the subject, while at the same time exhausting the temporal continuity of language. If the subject's disappearance produces language as independent construction, always fixed within one code, for Nestor Perlonger, the validation of language and the disappearance of the subject will mean a completely different thing. For the subject will disappear within a language that is impure, that invades all territories, and it is from this invasion in itself that the subject can disappear within language, but at the same time travel with it. Opposed to Huidobro, who wrote a poem about ascent and descent, about flying and about falling, Nestor Perlonger is not a poet of vertical or even arbitrary relations in a chain, but rather a poet of horizontality, of territoriality, of networks, and of borrowing. Born in the suburb of Avellaneda in Argentina in 1949, Perlonger died of AIDS in 1992.